I remember everything. He was standing right there. I am telling the truth.
It was him, Daniel.
Judge Miriam Kessler had read 4,000 verdicts in 22 years on the bench. She had learned, long ago, that the moment before the words left her mouth was the only moment that still belonged to everyone in the room equally. After that, someone always lost something. Courtroom 4B held its breath the way courtrooms do. Not silence exactly, but a held silence. The kind made of 40 people trying not to make a sound. The defendant, Daniel Reyes, sat with his hands flat on the table, knuckles pale. His public defender, a young woman named Priya Anand, who had tried 11 cases and lost 9, kept her eyes on her legal pad as if the paper might rearrange itself into something better. The charge was embezzlement. $200,000, moved in small increments over 14 months from the accounts of Whitmore Elementary, the public school where Daniel had worked as facilities manager. The evidence had been, by any reasonable measure, overwhelming. Bank transfers with his login credentials, a forged signature that handwriting analysis placed at 94% confidence. A motive, a daughter with a rare kidney condition, and medical bills that had eaten through 2 mortgages. Miriam did not believe in villains. She had said this once, early in her career, to a mentor who'd laughed and told her she'd learn better. She hadn't. 22 years later, she still didn't believe in villains, only in people who had run out of doors and picked the wrong window. But belief wasn't evidence, and evidence was what convicted men. She had the verdict written. She had read it twice in chambers, once aloud to the empty room, checking the weight of each sentence the way she always did, because words in a verdict were never just words. They were the last sentence of one life and the first sentence of another. "Mr. Reyes," she began, "will you please rise?" Daniel Reyes stood. He was 39 years old and looked 50, the particular aging that comes from calculating math you cannot outrun. His wife, Carla, sat 2 rows back, one hand pressed to her mouth. Their daughter, Sophia, 8 years old, the reason for all of it, was not in the courtroom. Children rarely were, in cases like this. It was, Miriam had always believed, a small mercy the system managed to preserve, which was why what happened next made no sense at all. The double doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Every head turned. The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Terrence who had worked this courtroom for 6 years and had never once let a door open without his say-so, took a half-step forward and then stopped, because the person walking through it was a child. She was small for 8. Miriam would learn her age later, though something in the set of her shoulders already told her. With dark hair in 2 uneven braids, the kind a father ties in the dark before a hospital appointment. She wore a cardigan 2 sizes too big for her, sleeves rolled to the wrist. In both hands, held out in front of her like something that might spill, was a white envelope, slightly bent at one corner. She walked down the center aisle. Nobody stopped her. That was the strange thing Miriam would think about later, that in a room built entirely around procedure, around who was allowed to speak and when and to whom, nobody moved to stop an 8-year-old girl from walking to the front of a federal courtroom because everyone in the room, for just a moment, forgot the procedure existed. Sophia Reyes stopped at the low wooden railing that separated the gallery from the well of the court. She looked up at her father first. Daniel made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Then she looked at Miriam. "I have to give this to the judge," she said. Her voice didn't shake. That was what struck Miriam most. Not fear, but a strange, terrible steadiness. The steadiness of a child who had rehearsed something many times because she understood, in whatever way an 8-year-old understands anything, that this was the only chance she'd get. Miriam had a verdict in her hand. She had a courtroom of 40 people waiting for 4 words: guilty or not guilty. She had a legal system built, brick by brick, over centuries, to ensure that emotion never outweighed evidence, that theater never substituted for truth. She looked at the envelope. She looked at the girl's steady hands. "Bailiff," Miriam said quietly, "please bring that to the bench." Somewhere behind her, she heard the court reporter's fingers pause over the keys, the first pause in 4 hours. Terence took the envelope from Sophia's hands with the particular gentleness of a man who had a granddaughter the same age. He carried it up the 3 steps to the bench, like it might detonate, though what he actually feared, he'd say later, was that it would be nothing, a child's drawing, an "I love you, Daddy" card that would break the room's heart without changing a single fact of law. Miriam took it. Up close, she could see the envelope had been opened once already and taped shut again, the tape uneven, applied by small hands. On the front, in careful, effortful print, "For the judge, it's important." "Sophia," Miriam said. She kept her voice at the register she used for frightened witnesses, not soft in a way that patronized, but level, the voice of someone who intended to listen. "Do you know where your mother is? She's outside. She doesn't know I have this." Sophia's chin lifted slightly. "She would have stopped me." A murmur moved through the gallery. Miriam raised 2 fingers without looking up, and the room quieted the way rooms did for her. She'd built that authority over 2 decades, one fair ruling at a time. "Why would she stop you?" "Because it's not supposed to be for me to know about," Sophia said. "I found it in Daddy's toolbox. The metal one in the garage. I wasn't looking for it. I was looking for the flashlight because my nightlight broke, and I found this instead, and I read some of it even though I know I'm not supposed to read Daddy's things, and then I didn't know what to do, so I've had it in my backpack for 11 days. 11 days. Miriam filed the number away without knowing yet why it mattered. "What is it, Sophia?" The girl's composure, which had held through the walk down the aisle, through the eyes of 40 strangers, cracked for just a moment. "It's about Mr. Hollis," she said. "The bald man who used to come to our house before Daddy got in trouble. I don't like him. He talks to Daddy in the voice grown-ups use when they're being mean, but pretending they're not." Miriam looked down at the envelope in her hands. Randall Hollis. The name meant nothing to her yet, but she noted, with the part of her mind that had spent 22 years learning to notice, that Daniel Reyes had gone very still in his chair, and that Priya Anand, his attorney, had looked up from her legal pad for the first time in an hour. "Sophia, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Did anyone tell you to bring this here today? Did anyone ask you to do this?" "No." Sophia shook her head hard enough that one braid swung loose. "I decided by myself. Last night, I couldn't sleep because I kept thinking about what happens if you say the bad word and Daddy has to go away, and I thought," her voice wavered for the first time, "I thought if the letter was important, maybe it could stop the bad word. And if it wasn't important, then at least I tried." There are moments in 22 years on the bench that a judge does not forget, and Miriam understood, even as it was happening, that this was becoming one of hers. She thought of every legal principle she'd built her career on: due process, chain of custody, the rules of evidence that existed precisely to prevent moments like this one, unvetted documents appearing in open court through channels no lawyer had sanctioned. And she thought of 11 days, a child carrying something in a backpack for 11 days, deciding, alone, without a single adult's counsel, that the truth mattered more than the trouble she might be in for finding it. "Bailiff," Miriam said, "please have someone from Victim Services sit with Sophia in my chambers. Get her mother." She looked to counsel tables. "Miss Anand, Mr. Castellano," the prosecutor, a precise man named Robert Castellano who had not moved a muscle through any of this. "We're taking a recess. 15 minutes. I want you both in chambers." She did not open the envelope in front of the courtroom. Whatever was inside it, it would not enter this case through the hands of a child and the eyes of strangers. If it mattered, it would matter properly, or not at all. Miriam's chambers were small and deliberately unglamorous. She'd turned down the larger office twice, believing something about oak paneling made judges forget they were people who could be wrong. A single window looked out on the parking structure. On her desk, a photograph of her late husband, a stack of case files, a mug that said "World's Okayest Golfer" that her clerk had bought as a joke 8 years ago and that she'd never had the heart to retire. She set the envelope on the desk between herself, Castellano, and Anand and did not touch it again. "This is highly irregular," Castellano said. He was not being obstructive. Miriam had tried enough cases with him to know he believed genuinely in procedure, the way some people believed in scripture. A minor entering evidence outside any chain of custody, outside discovery, after testimony has closed. "I'm aware of what it is, Robert." Miriam sat. "I'm also aware that if I ignore an 8-year-old's belief that her father is about to be wrongly convicted, and it turns out she was right, none of us sleep well for the rest of our careers. I'm not admitting anything into the record yet. I want to know what's in it before I decide what it means for this case." Priya Anand had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of a defense attorney watching a case reopen after she'd already grieved its loss. "Your Honor, if there's material exculpatory evidence, we don't know what it is yet." Miriam pulled on a pair of reading gloves from her desk drawer. Old habit, evidence-handling instincts that never fully retired even in chambers, and opened the envelope. Inside, 4 folded pages, handwritten, and a smaller sealed envelope within, and a single flash drive. The handwritten pages were a letter. Miriam read the first line silently. "If you're reading this, something happened to me, or I lost my nerve, or Hollis found out I kept a record before I could bring it anywhere. My name is Daniel Reyes, and I want to explain what I did and why. Because by the time anyone reads this, I'll probably already look guilty of everything, and maybe I am guilty of something, but not what they'll say." She read for 3 full minutes without speaking. Castellano and Anand watched her face, trying to read a verdict in her expression the way lawyers always did, uselessly. The letter described a scheme that predated Daniel's involvement, a slow bleed of school district funds orchestrated by Randall Hollis, the district's regional finance director, using access credentials and forged authorizations that ran through multiple facilities managers across 3 schools, of which Daniel was the newest and, the letter argued, the most convenient to frame, because Daniel's daughter's medical bills gave the story a motive that would make a jury stop asking questions. "He told me if I didn't sign off on the transfers, they'd find a way to blame me for discrepancies going back 2 years, before I even started. He said no one would believe a facilities guy over a district finance director. He was right about that part." The letter described dates, initials, a pattern of transfers Daniel had begun documenting 3 weeks before his arrest, terrified and unsure who to trust, hiding his evidence in the one place he thought no one would look, his own toolbox, meaning to bring it to a lawyer, an investigator, anyone, before Hollis or the arrest came first. The flash drive, Daniel's letter said, held photographs of the physical authorization forms before Hollis had them altered. Miriam set the pages down. "Robert," she said quietly, "I need you to understand that I am not making any finding right now. But I am not reading a verdict into the record until this has been examined, and I want your investigators looking at Randall Hollis's financial access logs by end of day." Castellano, to his credit, and Miriam would remember this about him for years, did not argue procedure again. He looked, instead, faintly ill. "If this checks out," he said, "I built a case on evidence someone handed me on a plate." "You built a case on the evidence you had," Miriam said. "That's the job. Sometimes the evidence lies to everyone at once." The recess became a week. Miriam had not, in 22 years, delayed a verdict this way, and she felt the particular vertigo of a person stepping outside a system built entirely on their own credibility for consistency. She told herself, and believed it, that consistency in service of injustice was not a virtue. Castellano's investigators moved fast, motivated by the specific fear of prosecutors who realize they may have nearly convicted the wrong man, a fear that produces, Miriam had noticed over the years, remarkably efficient investigation. Randall Hollis's financial access logs told a story the trial had never uncovered. Login timestamps from his home IP address correlating precisely with transfers that had been attributed, through forged digital signatures, to Daniel Reyes's credentials. A secondary bank account, opened 18 months earlier under a name that turned out to be Hollis's mother's maiden name, had received consistent deposits matching the missing funds almost dollar for dollar. The photographs on Daniel's flash drive, grainy, taken quickly with a phone camera, clearly shot by someone frightened of being caught documenting them, showed physical authorization forms with signatures that predated the digital forgeries. Daniel's actual signature, on the originals. Hollis's amendments, initialed separately, redirecting fund destinations after Daniel had already signed off on the legitimate amounts. Hollis, when investigators arrived at the district office to request his cooperation, did not run. He simply sat very still behind his desk, the way men do when they have spent a long time believing they were smarter than the system built to catch them, and are recalculating, in real time, how wrong that belief was. Miriam did not attend the arrest. That was not her role, and she had learned long ago the danger of judges who forgot where their role ended. But Castellano called her that evening, an unusual breach of formality between them, and told her simply, "It's him. It was always him." She sat in her kitchen with the phone in her hand for a long moment after he hung up. She thought about Sofia Reyes carrying an envelope in her backpack for 11 days, sleeping each night with a truth she didn't fully understand but knew. In the way children sometimes know things more clearly than adults, mattered more than the risk of getting in trouble for finding it. She thought about how close she had come to reading 4 words that would have taken a man's freedom for a crime committed by someone else, simply because the evidence had been built, carefully, to point away from its author. She did not sleep well that night. She had not expected to. The reconvened hearing, 10 days after Sophia walked down that aisle, was smaller than the original trial had been. Word had gotten out. These things always did. And there were reporters outside, a local story with the particular shape that travels, wrongly accused father cleared by daughter's letter. Miriam disliked the shape of it, the way it flattened Daniel Reyes into a symbol and Sophia into a plot device, when the truth was messier and more human than any headline could hold. A man who had been frightened and had hidden evidence rather than immediately trusting a system that had, in fact, nearly failed him. A child who had made a choice no 8-year-old should have had to make. Alone, at night, with a backpack. Daniel Reyes stood again when Miriam entered, but this time his hands weren't flat and pale on the table. Carla sat beside Priya Anand, not behind him, a small detail, but Miriam noticed such things. Sophia was not in the courtroom this time. She was, Miriam had been told, at school, because Carla had made the decision that her daughter's job in this case was finished, and that whatever came next belonged to the adults. "Mr. Castellano," Miriam said, "the government's position." Castellano rose. He did not perform contrition. Miriam respected that he never postured, even now. "The government moves to dismiss all charges against Daniel Reyes with prejudice. Randall Hollis has been charged with embezzlement, fraud, and forgery, and has, as of yesterday, begun cooperating with prosecutors regarding the full scope of the scheme, which the government now believes extends to 2 additional school districts and approximately 11 months prior to Mr. Reyes's employment. Ms. Anand, the defense joins the motion, Your Honor, and asks that the court also address the matter of Mr. Reyes's employment record and the reputational harm. That's a civil matter for another forum, and I'd encourage you to pursue it," Miriam said, not unkindly. Today this court has one job. She looked at the motion in front of her, then at Daniel Reyes, whose eyes were wet in the specific way of a man who has spent months rehearsing his own downfall and does not yet trust that it has stopped. Motion granted. All charges against Daniel Reyes are dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Reyes, you are free to go, and this court owes you an acknowledgement that our process came within one recess of a grave injustice, corrected only because your daughter did what none of the adults in her life, myself included, had yet found a way to do. She had not planned to say that last part. It was not strictly judicial language. She said it anyway, because she had decided somewhere in the last 10 days that some truths belonged in the record, even when they made the record less tidy. Daniel Reyes did not speak. He put both hands over his face, and Carla put her arm around him, and in the gallery, someone, a court employee, not a party to the case, simply a person who had watched the last 10 days unfold, began, quietly, to cry. Miriam asked to see Sophia once more before the case formally closed, not in the courtroom, but in her chambers, with Carla present, on a Saturday when the building was empty and the fluorescent hum of an unoccupied courthouse made everything feel smaller and more honest. Sophia sat across from her, in the chair that usually held attorneys arguing motions, her feet not reaching the floor, swinging slightly. She'd traded the oversized cardigan for a t-shirt with a cartoon fox on it. She looked, Miriam thought, exactly like what she was, an 8-year-old, finally allowed to be one again. I wanted to thank you, Miriam said. Properly, not as a judge, as a person. Sophia considered this with the gravity children sometimes bring to things adults have decided are simple. Did I do it right? I didn't know the rules. I thought maybe you'd be mad I interrupted. You broke several rules, Miriam said honestly, because she had promised herself she would not lie to this child even in kindness. Evidence isn't supposed to enter a courtroom that way. It's supposed to come through lawyers, through proper process, so nobody gets tricked by something that looks true but isn't. Sophia's face fell slightly. But, Miriam continued, the rules exist to protect the truth, Sophia. They're not supposed to bury it. And you found a way to bring the truth forward, when I promise you, the adults around you, including me, had run out of ways to find it in time. That doesn't mean you should have had to do that. It means the adults around you failed you a little, and you were braver than any of us. Daddy cried when the case was over, Sophia said. But it was a good crying. I've seen the bad kind. This wasn't that. No, Miriam agreed. That was the good kind. Carla, who had been quiet, spoke then. Your Honor, I need you to know, I would have stopped her, if I'd known, not because I didn't believe Daniel, because I was terrified of what would happen to an 8-year-old who walked into a federal courtroom uninvited. I've thought about it every night since. What if you'd had her removed before you ever saw the envelope? It was the question Miriam had turned over too, more than once. I've been a judge a long time, she said. Most days, the job is exactly what people imagine. Evidence, argument, precedent, a decision built on all of it. But every so often the job asks you to notice the moment in front of you instead of the procedure around it. I looked at your daughter's hands, Mrs. Reyes. They weren't shaking. A child who isn't lying to you doesn't usually hold that still. I've learned to trust that, over the rules, exactly as often as I need to, which is rarely, and only when it matters this much. Sophia had gone quiet, listening to the adults talk over her the way children do, absorbing more than they let on. Then she asked, with the particular directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to soften a question, Is Mr. Hollis going to go to jail? That's for another judge to decide, in another courtroom, Miriam said. But I think it's very likely, yes. Good, Sophia said, with no cruelty in it, only the clean moral certainty of a child who had watched an injustice nearly happen to someone she loved and wanted, simply for it to be made right. Then, after a pause, Can I ask you something else? Of course. Do you remember every case? Like, all 4,000? Miriam smiled. The first full smile she'd allowed herself in the 10 days since the recess began. No, most of them blur together after enough years. But I don't think I'll forget this one, Sophia. Not for the rest of my career. 6 weeks later, Miriam sat in her chambers, reviewing an unrelated case, a contract dispute, dry and procedural, the kind of case that made up the bulk of any judge's docket and rarely lingered in memory. Her clerk, a sharp young man named Oliver who had clerked for her for 2 years, knocked and told her there was a letter that had come through the courthouse mail, addressed simply to the judge from Sophia's case. Inside was a child's drawing, crayon, careful, the kind of careful that comes from a kid trying hard to get something right. It showed a courtroom, rendered the way an 8-year-old renders courtrooms, 2 large chairs, a bench drawn taller than the room's proportions could support, and at the center, a figure in black robes with an exaggerated smile, and beside her, a smaller figure holding an envelope, also smiling. Above them, in the same careful print from the original envelope, "Thank you for listening." Miriam kept it. Not on her bench. That would have violated the particular boundary she maintained between the job and the person doing it. But in her desk drawer, beneath the case files, where she could see it each time she reached for something else. She thought, often in the months that followed, about the 14 seconds, she'd counted them once, reviewing the court reporter's timestamp, between Sophia walking through those double doors and Miriam calling the bailiff forward. 14 seconds in which 40 adults in a room built on procedure had simply stopped, watching a child do something none of them had permission to do, and none of them had stopped her. She thought about what she'd told Carla Reyes, that the job asked her to notice the moment, not just the process, rarely, and only when it mattered enough. She wondered, sometimes, how many other moments like it had passed through her courtroom over 22 years without her noticing them in time. How many envelopes had gone unopened simply because no one walked them to the front of the room. She did not have an answer to that. She suspected no judge ever fully did. The docket did not pause for reflection. 3 months after the Reyes case closed, Miriam stood before a new courtroom, a new case, a new set of 40 strangers holding their breath the way rooms do. This time, before she read anything, she looked, briefly, at the back doors of the courtroom, an instinct she hadn't had before Sophia, and one she suspected she would carry for the rest of her career. The doors stayed closed. This verdict, when she read it, was simply a verdict. Evidence considered, arguments weighed, judgment rendered, no envelopes, no interruptions, the ordinary weight of an ordinary case. But that evening, reviewing her calendar for the following week, she found herself pausing over each case file a moment longer than she used to, not doubting the process, but remembering, with a clarity she hoped she'd never lose, that the process was only as good as the humans administering it, and that sometimes the truth arrived through the door nobody expected, carried by hands too young to know they were breaking the rules, and steady enough to matter anyway. Sophia Reyes, she'd later learned through a card at Christmas from Carla, had decided she wanted to be a lawyer, not a judge, too much waiting for other people to notice things, she'd apparently told her mother, with the particular confidence of a 9-year-old who had once carried a truth 11 days and delivered it in 14 seconds. Miriam kept the drawing in her desk for the rest of her career. She did not need it to remember. But she liked, on the hardest days, having something to hold that reminded her why she'd paused, once, before reading a verdict, and why, every case after, she made certain to look, however briefly, at the doors.
14 seconds. That's how long it took for a courtroom full of adults to freeze, and for one 8-year-old girl to do what none of them could. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a witness. She was just a daughter who refused to believe the system had already decided her father's fate. And here's the part that should stay with you. Judge Kessler didn't follow the rule book that day. She followed the moment. Because sometimes the truth doesn't walk in through the front door with a badge and a briefcase. It walks in wearing an oversized cardigan, holding an envelope with shaking resolve but steady hands. We tell stories like this because justice isn't just about evidence. It's about who's brave enough to speak up when it matters most. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. We bring you one unforgettable true-to-life story every single week. And I'll ask you this. If you were in that courtroom, would you have opened the envelope? Drop your answer below. I read every single one.